Hello, good morning. How's everyone doing today? All right, so good to see everyone. All right, so thank you for attendance on a Saturday morning. At 9, actually, so that should be commended. We have a saying, there's a saying, for example, within the Sufi circles, actually, I'm not a Sufi, within the Sufi circles, it's a saying that, for example, that if someone gives you some clothes, as a gift. Well, for example, if someone gave me some clothes and then I decided to give them as a gift to someone else, then I can always get some more clothes. And then if someone gave me some money and I gave that money to another person, I could always get that money back. However, if someone gives me their time, that's something I can never get back. All right, so I want to tell you thank you for devoting your time to come on a Saturday morning. And then we're going to get started. We're going to talk about slavery in the context of Africa. And since my field is Sudan, then I'm going to talk about it within the context of Sudanese slavery during the Mahdist period, which is from 1885 to 1898. So if you have any questions whatsoever, because a lot of this information is new and unfamiliar to the uninitiated, so just raise your hand. You don't have to wait until the end. You can just raise your hand, and then I'll ask you any kind of questions you have. And I'll try to put some things on the board. I have this map, and then I'll go back and forth between this map and then some other images concerning Sudan and concerning slavery as well. So I'm going to begin by giving a brief introduction concerning slavery within the context of Islam. And that will segue into a discussion concerning slavery within the context of Sudan. Then I'll talk about the Mahdist revolt, which occurred from 1885 to 1898, and what the Mahdi did as far as slavery is concerned. Relationship to his proclamation concerning slavery, the slave trade, and emancipation of slaves. So this is what we're going to do for Indian lifetime as well. All right, so slavery is an institution that's existed from time immemorial. There's no societies that I can think of that have been free of this institution. All right? It's existed in one form or another in almost all societies, and Muslim societies are no exception to this rule as well. So slavery as an institution predates Islam in the Arabian Peninsula. This entire region here. This entire region here is known as the Arabian Peninsula. So it encompasses Saudi Arabia, contemporary Saudi Arabia, and Yemen. This entire region here is considered the Arabian Peninsula. All right, so extensively, scholars mention that Islam has its foundations in this region, and then they note that Islam began around 622. That's the first year as far as the Muslim calendar is concerned, around 622. So, but then there are Arabs living in this region, and so slavery predates Islam in the Arabian Peninsula by several centuries. We know about this because as scholars, we have read the literature of these pre-Islamic Arabs, and then that literature usually taken the form in poetry. So pre-Islamic poetry written by these poets/adventurers. And so one of the most important of these poets and warriors was a man by the name of Antara ibn Shaddad. And then his mother was an Ethiopian slave. And his father was a member of the Banu Abs Arab tribe and a member of this kind of aristocratic class. His mother was a slave, and then his father was an Arab freeman. Nonetheless, Antara ibn Shaddad, I'll write his name on the board. All right, so Antara ibn Shaddad. So I'll write it here. See this? And I'll write it over here on this side as well. So keep in mind, this is before Islam. This is a period called the Age of Ignorance. So it's the Jahiliyyah period. So Antara, his mother is an Ethiopian slave by the name of Zabiha, and then his father's an individual from this tribe called the Banu Abs, and he is the chief of this tribe. So Antara was one of the greatest warriors. Him and his brother were the strongest, greatest poets, the most brilliant. And Antara had one flaw, actually. Antara had one flaw. He was a person that was very romantic, very kind of emotional, and he fell in love with Abla, his cousin, right? So this is not something that's untoward, it's not unseemly for us within our context here in the West, right? It's going to offend our Western sensibilities, but then within the context of pre-Islamic Arabia, people would marry their cousins. You marry your first cousin, right? So he fell in love with his cousin, but then her father refused him because he was a slave of slave descent. His mother was Ethiopian slave, despite the fact that his father was a member, was the chief of the tribe. And so Antara and his brothers essentially were these people, the strongest warriors. And so they would fight many wars between these other Arab tribes. On one occasion, Antara said, neither me or my brothers are going to fight because I'm not worthy to marry your daughter. So there's one occasion they were fighting this other group, the Banu Thaqif tribe. So Antara and his brothers were sitting on their horses, overlooking this hill, and then watching the battle unfold. And so Antara's tribe was getting bested by this other tribe. And then people were calling down, asking them, descend and help us. He said, no, we're not going to help you. Lot at all, we're not going to help you. We're not worthy. So finally, Antara's uncle, which was Abla's father, said, Antara, come down and defend your tribe, and then I will think about allowing you to marry my daughter. So, without further hesitation, he and his brothers descended and defeated, decimated that entire tribe. So the uncle, he gave his word, and he said, well, I can think about this, but then, in order for you to marry Abla, you're going to have to go and engage in all of these kind of acts, right? So Antara had to engage in all of these different acts, right? These kind of Herculean endeavors. And to bring back a specific sword from a specific region in Yemen, and then he had to go to Najd, which is Central Arabia, bring back a specific camel as well. So engage in all these acts, but then he ultimately was killed, died, before he was able to marry Abla. So the reason I'm telling you this is not just to begin with the kind of melodramatic story at 9:15 in the morning. The reason I'm telling you this is that to illustrate historically that slavery existed in the Arabian Peninsula prior to the arrival of Islam. And so we have evidence of this due to this poetry that's written in the Jahiliyyah period. And then even further evidence, for example, the Prophet's adopted son. The Prophet's adopted son, Zayd ibn Haritha, was an Arab slave, right? Muhammad freed him from slavery. And so the pre-Islamic Arabs, slavery had no ethnicity, and then it had no linguistic preference. So the pre-Islamic Arabs were equal opportunity enslavers. The slaves that they took came from wars of conquest, and they purchased slaves as well. The majority of the slaves in pre-Islamic Arabia were white, right, that they purchased from this region here. So the Byzantine Empire, and then this region, so this is the Byzantine Empire that controls Greater Syria at this time period. So they purchased their slaves or they enslaved their slaves. And slavery, as I mentioned, was not ethnically nor racially based in this time period. However, the treatment of slaves during this time period could be quite arbitrary in nature. So quite arbitrary indeed. So, for example, Sumayya bin Khalaf is famous for being the first martyr in Islam. So this is prior to, so she converted to Islam, and then her slave master, Abu Jahl, tried to disabuse her of the notion of becoming a Muslim. So what did he do? He killed her with a spear through the heart. So this is the first martyr of Islam, Sumayya bin Khalaf. And then you have, for example, another slave, Ethiopian slave, right? His name is Bilal. He's the first Muslim, the first caller to prayer. And then his slave master, Umayyad, he put a rock on this man's chest to prevent him, to also disabuse him of the notion of becoming a Muslim. So, while the rock was on Bilal's chest, Bilal still maintained his allegiance to Islam by pointing his finger to the sky, saying one, meaning there's only one God. So this is prior to Islam becoming an institution in the Arabian Peninsula as well. So with the arrival of Islam and its becoming an institution, when the Muslims moved from Mecca to Medina in around 622, right? So when the Muslims moved from Mecca to Medina, the nascent Muslim community, Medina became an institution. They had mosques. There was a mosque that was built. Muhammad was able to preach free of any kind of molestation whatsoever. And so the situation of slavery, the situation of the slaves became ameliorated, improved. So you cannot treat the slaves in a very arbitrary manner. So on the outset, I want to say that slavery in Islam is permitted, but it's not sanctioned. It's permissible, but it's not sanctioned. So the Quran and then the traditions of the Prophet, Quran and the traditions of the Prophet, they view slavery as an exceptional condition. So and then this exceptional condition can only occur under specific circumstances, specific situations. So what are those situations? So those situations are an individual is captured in war, war captive, and are non-Muslims, they can be enslaved. But first, you have to first ransom them. If no one ransoms them, if no one pays for their ransom, then they will be enslaved. Then, the other condition of servitude in the context of Islam is this. So, if you are born of two slave parents, despite the fact that they're Muslims, you will be a slave. So I will repeat, the conditions of servitude within Islam are that there are two conditions. So first, war captives, and then, you guys didn't hear?
No.
Sorry.
See if it, yeah. Yeah, I know. I was saying maybe it batteries. Batteries.
We're going to project.
Because we're going to need them.
No problem. I'm going to project. Project my board. So can you hear in the back?
You project a little bit more.
All right, I'm going to walk about, and then I'll project from there as well. All right, so very good. All right, can you hear me now? This room to be very good. Can you hear me? All right, maybe I stay here. I'll stay this one. How's this? Can you guys hear me as well? On the right, on my right side. All right, good.
Just in case.
All right, so do you hear anything I just said for the past 20 minutes? Okay. All right, so just to repeat, I said, for example, within the context of Islam, slavery can only exist under two specific conditions. And so those two specific conditions are slaves captured in war, so war captives, prisoners of war. If anyone does not claim them as a ransom, those individuals will be enslaved and then referred to Islam. And then the second condition is that if you have two Muslims that are slaves, their offspring are going to be slaves as well. The only legitimate war within the context of Islam is jihad. And then the only way you can fight a jihad is defensive. So when we're hearing every day on the news about this jihad that ISIS is fighting. All right, some people may argue with me, but then that's not a jihad, actually. So the only legitimate war that these only individuals that can be enslaved are war captives in a jihad, and then a jihad is supposed to protect the sanctity of the Muslim caliphate, the sanctity of the Muslim state. It's supposed to be a defensive measure. So what you have, so just again, the example, you have children of slaves, they are going to be slaves, and then the Quran, and then the traditions of the Prophet consider manumission of slaves to be a deed that is replete, ripe with merit. So it encourages individuals to manumit slaves and free slaves. So you can do this, for example, it will expiate any kind of sin. For example, if you miss fasting during the month of Ramadan, one of the ways to essentially make up this fast is to free a slave. And then it says, for example, in the second chapter of the Quran, that you should take any opportunity to free these slaves as well. The Prophet Muhammad himself encouraged the manumission of slaves as well. Even if one had to purchase these slaves first, purchase a slave, and then you free them as well. So Muhammad gave orders to his companions that they should take every opportunity to free these slaves. So for example, Muhammad himself personally freed 63 slaves, and then his wife Aisha freed 67, and in total his household of friends freed about 39,000 slaves alone. And so the most notable of these slaves that the Prophet freed was this woman by the name of Safiya bint Huyay, and then he freed her and he married her. And then there's another slave, a Christian woman, a Christian Coptic woman from Egypt, Maryam al-Qibtiyya. She was freed, and then Prophet Muhammad married her as well. And then the Prophet Muhammad freed her sister and married her sister to another of his companions. So again, let's repeat this again. So Prophet Muhammad freed 63 slaves, his wife freed 67 slaves, and then in total the Prophet Muhammad and his entire community, his companions freed over 39,000 slaves as well. So the word, sometimes you hear this word bandied about, abd in Arabic. It means slave or servant, but then that term is rarely used. So for example, in the Quran, it mentions what your right hands possess, what your right hands possess, and it always encourages the free of these slaves as well. The Quran recognizes the basic human nature of slaves, not like the slavery that was practiced here in the continental United States, right? So for example, the slave condition here in the United States, slaves were not considered human. They were considered chattel, whereas within the context of Islam, slaves were considered human beings, a debased form of human being, but a human being nonetheless. So this is evidence, for example, the various roles that slaves played in Muslim society. So here in the West, the transatlantic slave trade, we don't have any kind of concept of elite slaves. We don't have slaves that essentially were military slaves that rose through the ranks and became advisors to the rulers of the society. But then within the Muslim context, within Muslim society, we have numerous slaves that began their service in the army, rose to the ranks, and then became advisors, viziers, and then ultimately some became rulers as well. Even in the context of South Asia, we have some military slaves that ruled, that were originally from Ethiopia, that ruled the region on the western border of the South Asian or the Indian subcontinent as well. All right, so for example, there's a ruler. There was an individual that was an Ethiopian slave by the name of Kabur al-Ashadi. And then he ruled Egypt as the de facto ruler of Egypt from 946. So he was a eunuch. He was very brilliant. politician, the ruler of Egypt at this time period died. His sons were too young to rule. So Khalifa essentially ruled in their stead, meaning that he became the de facto ruler of Egypt, even when his sons became adults. Then he continued to rule. So he ruled Egypt for 20 years. And then time began to progress. He became the de jure ruler of Egypt, not merely the de facto ruler of Egypt. And he ruled Egypt until his death in 968, their common era. So this is an example of elite slaves within the context of Islam, right? So we don't have any evidence of this within the transatlantic slave trade, or Western societies whatsoever. But then this is evident. There are many examples like this within the context of these Muslim societies. This time period. So the prompt was, do you think, for example, that transatlantic slavery, do you believe that the Muslim slave trade, do you believe that Muslim societies engage in a more benign form of slavery than Western societies did? So that was the prompt. So I'm just reminding you of the prompt because time and time again, you would read about, oh, the Muslims treated their slaves so well. And then it was not like how the Americans treated their slaves as well. So this is something that you need to think about in the maritime that we have. And I'll talk about slavery within the context of Sudan as well. The transatlantic slave trade, their numbers that they say that we're taking are between 11 and 20 million individuals. So transatlantic slave trade, John Hunwick, and then Paul Lovejoy. These are individuals who write great deals about slavery within the context of the Mediterranean world. They mentioned that they maintain that the Islamic slave trade. Do I need this? I do? Okay, it's impressive. I was trying to project. Is it better? Okay. All right, so I was saying that, for example, these individual scholars that work on Mediterranean slave trade, such as Paul Lovejoy, they note that the Muslim societies engage in slavery for a longer time period, and it encompasses more regions than that of the Western societies. For example, when we talk about Muslim societies within the context of Africa, we're talking about the Nile Valley region, where Egypt and Sudan are, the Trans-Saharan region as well, and then Mediterranean slave trades. I want to focus on the main time on the Nile Valley region, specifically the Sudan. So Lovejoy and then people of Israel say that the slave trade that was practiced in these various regions predated that of the transatlantic slave trade, and then lasted longer than that of the transatlantic slave trade. I'll give you an example. They just ended slavery in 1964 in Saudi Arabia. In 1982, they ended slavery in Mauritania. And then they continue to try to, it's like an ongoing process as far as Mauritania is concerned. And then in Sudan as well. And then in Ethiopia, they ended slavery sometime in the early part of the 20th century. And then they officially ended slavery in Sudan in around the 1930s. So this is information that you may need to answer that prompt as well. We're going to talk about slavery within the context of Islam. And then I'll open up for questions as well. All right, so the slave trade in the Sudan became a major commercial enterprise. It became a major aspect of the economy of the Sudan in the 19th century, in the Common Era. So this became in 1877. After 1877, the slave trade became the most dominant, the predominant occupation of the northern Sudanese. So became the predominant occupation of the northern Sudanese after 1877. And so the Egyptian government, at the behest of the British, right, they tried to suppress the slave trade into Sudan, but then to no avail. They tried to suppress it. They sent steamers down the Nile River, apprehending any kind of slave goes, right? Steamers traveling down. Anyone that was engaging in trading in slaves was arrested, and the slaves were free. But where were the slaves going to go? So they always took time to return to their slave masters, because they didn't have any other places to go to as well. So the Sudanese, so this slave trade, essentially, the suppression of the slave trade, not the slave trade, the suppression of the slave trade, essentially, laid the foundation for civil unrest and local revolts in the Sudan after 1877. The Mahdist revolt that occurred in 1882, began around 1882, 1883, is a response to the suppression of the slave trade. So you're asking yourself, why are people going to revolt because of the suppressing the slave trade? You think they may revolt because of slavery, but why would they revolt because of the suppression of the slave trade? Because I said that the suppression of the slave trade impacted upon their ability to make a living. I alluded to just now that the predominant occupation of the Sudanese in the northern part of Sudan all revolved around the slave trade. So the British come there, place pressure upon the Egyptian government to end slavery, then that's going to impact upon the northern Sudanese to make a living. And so there are revolts. There are revolts in the western part of Sudan. There are revolts in the northern part of Sudan and the central part of Sudan as well. There was an individual that manifested himself, fashioned himself, styled himself as his expected deliverer, his expected individual is going to lead the people out of darkness and onto the path of righteousness. And this man's name was Muhammad, and he maintained that he was this expected Messiah. And then he manifested himself as this Mahdi, this expected Messiah, in around 1883. And so he wrote several proclamations and several edicts and several fatwa, which are non-binding legal opinions. And then he said, for example, that slavery, whatever the Prophet Muhammad has sanctioned, that no man has the authority to get rid of. And so he had no issues whatsoever with slavery, whatsoever. And so many people flocked to his side in order to join forces with him, because he was going to fight against those individuals that were responsible for the suppression of slavery in the Sudan. So who are these individuals? These individuals were the most hated people in the Sudan at this time period. The Egyptians. The Turco-Egyptians. In 1821, as I alluded to yesterday, Egypt invaded the Sudan. So at this time period, Egypt's under the control of, supposed to be under control of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans were so weak that their viceroy, their governor, is really the ruler of Egypt. His name is Muhammad Ali. So he's the ruler of Egypt. He invades he invades Sudan. So why is he interested in Sudan? So he's interested in Sudan because he has these grand schemes of creating an empire, and then creating an empire needs an army. So where are you going to get an army that's very loyal to you? You need an army of slaves that you raise. So I'll write his name over here as well. So he thought, I'm going to go to the Sudan. I'm going to the southern part of Sudan. This is where the majority of the people that we know of that are have a very great physique, right? They're very tall, they're very strong, and then they will serve as slave soldiers in my army that I'm going to build in order to continued these wars of conquest. So Egypt at this time period is kind of imperial design. It's imperial scheme, right? Create this empire, right? So Sudan was invaded by Egypt specifically for the purpose of slaves in this region here. So most of the slaves came from this region here. The southern part of Sudan, the southern part of Sudan is where most of these slaves came from. And they mostly were these Nilotic people, such as the Shilluk, and Noor, and then the Dinka, and then you see other groups as well. So when Egypt invaded the Sudan, they conquered Sudan, imposed their rule upon the Sudanese, so imposed a rule upon the Sudanese people, imposed these taxes upon the Sudanese people, and then in order for the Sudanese people to pay these taxes, right, they didn't have any kind of cash economy. How are they going to pay taxes? So beatings ensued. The Egyptians encouraged all Sudanese people, so this is 1821, 1822, 1823, encouraged the Sudanese people to engage in the slave trade. So the slave trade became an integral part of Sudanese society because of the Egyptians. So you have people in the north that were these farmers, right? They were forced, because of the Egyptian presence in the Sudan, to engage in slavery, slave trade, travel down the Nile, up the Nile, and then capture these slaves. And so these people that were in the northern part of Sudan, they had a military advantage over these southern Sudanese people, because the southern Sudanese people had the most rudimentary of weapons, such as spears and then shields, whereas the northern Sudanese individuals, they had guns, firearms, so it was very easy for them to take control of and capture these slaves. So the northern Sudanese are Muslims, so what they're doing is considered un-Islamic, because you can't enslave, under the dictates of Islamic law, right? You can't just go and capture slaves. Remember, there are only two conditions of servitude within Islam: war captives, and then if you have children that are born of two enslaved peoples, right? So this is un-Islamic, within the context of Sharia, within the context of Islamic law. And then the Egyptians were encouraging this sort of behavior. You had certain individuals that were able to carve up a small, petty kingdom for themselves in the southern part of Sudan because of slave trade. Such individuals such as this man by the name of Mansour al-Rahman. So there's even a street named after him in Umdurman. Many southern Sudanese were very upset about this, but that's beside the point. It's outside of the purview of this lecture. Nonetheless, so you have these individuals from the northern part of Sudan descending upon the southern part of Sudan, capturing these slaves, selling them in these slave markets in around coasting, Khartoum, and then these slaves making their way to Egypt and ended up in slave markets in Egypt, and then serving as slave soldiers in Egypt, and some of them even made their way across the Red Sea into the Ottoman Empire as well. So the Mahdi wrote many of these proclamations decrying the existence of the Egyptians in the Sudan. First, he noted that the position of these taxes upon the Sudanese by another Muslim polity is un-Islamic. He said that these taxes were jizya taxes. These are taxes, for example, that Muslim polities impose upon non-Muslim polities. He said the Egyptians are imposing these taxes upon the Sudanese, and this is un-Islamic. In addition, requiring the slaves, requiring the Sudanese to embark upon capturing these slaves was un-Islamic as well. He didn't have an issue with slavery, but they had an issue with what the Egyptians were encouraging the Sudanese to do during this time period. So the Mahdi, in 1882, said to his followers, right, I am an individual that is guided by God. I'm the expected Mahdi. So within the context of Muslim eschatology, the belief is that every 100 years a renewal of the faith will come, and every 1,000 years an individual, an expected individual, a deliverer, a guide, an individual, for example, that will lead the people down the path of righteousness will come. So people were expecting this individual. They're expecting this guide, this Messiah, because it was that was the 19th century on our calendar, like on the Gregorian calendar, but then it's the 13th century as far as the Muslim calendar is concerned. So that was the beginning of a new millennium for the Muslims. People were expecting that, yes, this individual perhaps indeed is this Messiah that's going to happen. So he came, began preaching, and they had many people follow him. Most of the people were not interested in his religious message. The only interest that they took him, that he was going to fight the Turks, the Egyptians. Because he said the Turks, the Turco-Egyptian forces that were in Sudan at this time, had corrupted the religion of the people to such an extent that the only thing that remains in the Sudan concerning Islam is its name. And then people don't know anything about the Quran whatsoever. So he's going to revive Islam in the Sudan. So people started to join forces with them, specifically because he's going to fight the Turks. And then people were going to fight the Turks in order to have the Turks, the Egyptians, stop suppressing the slave trade. So this is 1882. Remember, 1877, the Egyptians began to suppress the slave trade. In 1882, the Mahdi manifested himself as the Mahdi, and then many individuals joined forces with him to battle the Turks. Specifically, these individuals, this tribe from the western part of Sudan, there are some of the most notorious slave traders and slave dealers, slave capturers, and they're known as the Bagara Arabs. And then these people raise cattle, and they're very mobile, and then they use horses as well. So, and then they're neighbors of these people that are in the southern part of Sudan. So they were involved as far as capturing them, enslaving them, and selling them to Egyptians. So the backbone of the Mahdi's military force came from these people who were not really interested in his religious message. Rather, they were interested specifically because he was going to fight the Egyptians, the Turco-Egyptians that were suppressing the slave trade. So there are many proclamations that were issued by the Turks, by the Egyptians. So I'm using those two terms interchangeably. The Sudanese themselves use Turks because it further emphasizes the illegitimacy of these people. They're not Arabs. They have no legitimacy as far as ruling the Sudan. So they continue to refer to these people as Turks. Anyone that worked for the Sudanese, anyone that worked for the occupying forces was labeled a Turk. You could bring Circassian, Egyptian, even Sudanese that were co-opted by the Egyptian government, they were labeled as Turks as well. So the Turkish Egyptian government issued many proclamations to get slavery to come to a close. They only did this because they were being pressurized by the British. So you have all these proclamations. You have steamers traveling up and down the Nile. But then the Egyptians just merely paid lip service to these proclamations because no one really wanted slavery to end. Only the British. So even the ruler of Egypt, Khalifa Ismail, he continued to keep slaves despite the fact that he was saying that he was trying to end slavery. So no one really wanted slavery to end. The Egyptians didn't want slavery to end. The Sudanese didn't want slavery to end whatsoever. And the Mahdi had no interest whatsoever in slavery. He was only interested in reviving Islam. So what's going to happen as far as slavery is concerned once the Mahdist revolt has become successful against the Turks, the Turco-Egyptian forces in the Sudan? So there are many battles that were fought between the Mahdist forces and then the Turco-Egyptian forces in the Sudan. Ultimately, the Turco-Egyptian forces were defeated by the Mahdist forces in 1885. So they were defeated in the Battle of Khartoum in 1885. So the Mahdi has this plan, right? Almost all of these Muslim revivers, reformers, they have the same goal. For example, you're watching television, you're asking me about ISIS, right? So they have the same goal. Almost all they have the same goal. Osama bin Laden has the same goal. Al-Qaeda has the same goal. They have all the same goals. But the whole goal is to establish Islamic law, create a state that essentially mirrors that of the first Islamic state in Medina in the 7th century. That's the goal of almost all of these so-called extremist groups, right? Extremist movements. The goal is to create a state that's based upon Sharia, Islamic law, and then a state that mirrors that of the first Islamic state in Medina in the 7th century. That's during the time period the Prophet was alive. It's like the normative period of Islam as well. So this is the goal. So the Mahdi, this was what he did. So he conquered the Sudan from the Turks. But then he didn't live long enough to see his goal come to fruition. He died 6 months after the conquest of Khartoum. But then the rule fell upon the perfectly capable shoulders of his lieutenant, and then his trusted patriarch, a man by the name of the Khalifa Abdullah Taishi. And this man took the state and fashioned it in the vision that the Mahdi had. Right? Purge, the implementation of Sharia, Islamic law, right? So that entails everything revolves around commitment to the Quran and traditions of the Prophet Muhammad. Everything, for example, women should not be seen on the streets naked. So by naked, I mean that they have to wear the hijab and such. And then the courts revolve around Islamic law as well. So everyone has to make all the prayers. If you hear the call to Adhan, if you hear the call to prayer, you have to go to the mosque as well. So how does slavery play out during this time period as well? So you would think, well, slavery perhaps will come to an end, but no, slavery did not come to an end because it's an Islamic state. Islam permits slavery. It does not sanction slavery, so it permits slavery within specific conditions. So they had several wars during this time period. They had fought a war with Ethiopia. So many slaves that were taken from this war with Ethiopia were captured and enslaved. And then they were taken to the public treasury of the Muslims. The public treasury of the Muslims was a slave market. People could come and purchase these slaves into the public treasury. During this time period, there are many battles fought between many of these Arab tribes in the western part of Sudan. So they were always in the habit of fighting amongst themselves and enslaving each other, specifically the women, right? Capturing the women and enslaving them. So there was a proclamation that was issued by the Mahdi. It said that these are Muslim women. You cannot enslave them. Stop this practice. Desist from this practice. And then there's one incident, for example, where an individual came from Morocco, traveled from Morocco with his family. One of his family members was a former slave. And then when he made their way to Sudan, so during this time people were traveling to the Sudan because they heard about the Mahdi. So this individual is traveling from Morocco, comes from Morocco, and then comes to the Sudan, and people capture members of his family, say that they were slaves. They wrote to the Mahdi. The Mahdi said, free these individuals because they are Muslims. So the Mahdi essentially was trying to refashion slavery. He's not interested in suppressing the slave trade or ending slavery, but then he's just trying to refashion slavery within its kind of Islamic identity. So as far as his attitudes concerning manumission, during this time period, after the war, after the battles between the Turks and then the Sudanese followers of the Mahdi, there are many slaves that were displaced because their masters were killed. Their masters were killed, and so one of the Mahdi's commanders asked him, wrote a letter to the Mahdi, said, what should we do with these slaves that are gathered in the city in Khartoum? What should we do with them? Should we free them? Or should we incorporate them within the army? The Mahdi wrote back. He said, don't free them, incorporate them within the army. So there were slave soldiers during the Mahdi's battles with the Egyptians. They were known as the Jihadiyya. They used firearms, and then they were very successful as far as helping the Mahdist forces defeat the Egyptian forces during this time period as well. So what are his attitudes concerning the suppression of the slave trade, and then the Turks in general. So I kind of alluded to this. I said that he essentially had no interest whatsoever in the ending of slavery in the Sudan. He merely wanted to take on an Islamic kind of fashion, reshape it in its Islamic guise. So he had no interest whatsoever in ending it, and then he had concerns with the British trying to continue to suppress slavery. So, for example, British kind of, what they did is that they instituted this Slave Trade Convention Act, like around 1833. Any individuals, any territories that the British controlled or had any kind of influence over, the British said slavery had to end, actually. Slavery had to come to a close. That included Egypt and then the Sudan during this time period. And so they put pressure on the Sudanese. They sent 2 soldiers, Samuel Baker and then General Charles Chinese Gordon, to end slavery. They were successful while they were there, specifically in this region here, southwestern part of Sudan. But then when they left, slavery continued to emerge. Slavery continued to emerge. Gordon was called back to end slavery, but then his activities were to no avail. Slavery continued to exist in the Sudan. And even after the Mahdists were defeated, so Egypt and Britain reconquered the Sudan in 1898, even after Sudan was reconquered by Britain and then Egypt, and then you have the formation of what's known as the Anglo-Egyptian Condominium, where Egypt and Britain ruled the Sudan. Slavery continued to exist. You have the Governor General of the Sudan saying, well, we have to, this institution is so entrenched within the cultural landscape of the people, we just cannot end it outright. What we have to do is just end it kind of gradually, slowly, because it's going to upset the cultural balance in this time period. So as I began, as I will end, I said that slavery didn't really have an official end in Sudan until around the 1930s. And then slavery continued to exist in that region, Ethiopia, until around the first half of the 20th century. And then slavery, as far as the Muslim society is concerned, in Saudi Arabia continued to exist in 1964. Mauritania, right, slavery continued to exist until around 1982. There's still slavery in Mauritania as well, and then many other places as well. But then slavery takes many forms, so I'm talking about this kind of classic form of slavery, servitude, as far as Muslim societies are concerned.